There are photographs that capture a moment in time, preserving smiles, celebrations, and ordinary days long forgotten. Then there are photographs that refuse to let go, images that burrow into your mind and whisper questions you can't answer. In a dusty antique shop in Portland, Maine, a collector named David Richardson found one such photograph in the spring of 2019. The portrait was dated 1908, mounted in a tarnished silver frame that had seen better days. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable. A little girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing in a photographer's studio wearing a white lace dress, her expression solemn as was customary in that era. But David's hands began to tremble when he looked closer at what the child was holding. The antique shop sat on Congress Street, tucked between a coffee house and a bookstore that smelled of old paper and vanilla candles. David had been collecting Victorian-era photographs for nearly 15 years, drawn to the way those images preserved faces that would otherwise be lost to history. He visited the shop every Saturday morning, a ritual that had become as essential to him as his morning coffee. The owner, an elderly woman named Martha Chen, knew his tastes well and always set aside items she thought might interest him. That particular morning in April was unseasonably cold. Portland had experienced a late winter storm, and patches of dirty snow still clung to the shadows of buildings. David pushed through the door, the bell above jingling, and Martha greeted him with her usual warm smile. She gestured toward a cardboard box on the counter, filled with estate sale finds from a house in the West End neighborhood. The previous owner had passed away at 93, leaving behind a lifetime of accumulated memories that distant relatives had no interest in preserving. David sifted through the box methodically. There were letters tied with faded ribbon, postcards from destinations that no longer existed under the same names, and several framed photographs. Most were typical portraits from the early 20th century, stiff families posed in front of painted backdrops, young men in military uniforms, couples on their wedding day. Then his fingers closed around the silver frame, smaller than the others, and he lifted it into the light streaming through the shop window. The little girl stared back at him with dark eyes that held no trace of childhood joy. Her dress was pristine white lace with a high collar, the kind wealthy families would have commissioned for formal portraits. Her hair was dark, pulled back severely from her face and tied with a large white bow. The photographer's studio backdrop showed a painted garden scene, roses and trellises, that were meant to suggest elegance and refinement. Everything about the photograph followed the conventions of the era perfectly, except for what the girl was holding. In her small hands, pressed against the white fabric of her dress, was a doll. But this was not an ordinary doll. Its face was cracked porcelain, one eye missing entirely, leaving a dark hollow socket. The other eye remained, staring outward with an unsettling intensity. The doll's dress was torn and stained with what appeared to be dark blotches. Most disturbing were the doll's hands. One was missing entirely, broken off at the wrist, while the other seemed to be reaching upward in a gesture that looked almost like pleading. David turned the frame over with shaking hands. On the back, written in faded ink, were 3 lines of text. Clara Morrison, aged 8, November 1908. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had added, "God forgive us all." David purchased the photograph for $20. Martha seemed relieved to be rid of it. As she wrapped it in newspaper, she mentioned that the estate sale had an odd feeling to it, though she couldn't explain why. The house had been beautiful, she said, a Victorian mansion with original woodwork and stained glass windows, but something about it had made her uncomfortable. She had sorted through the items quickly, eager to leave. Back in his apartment in the old Port District, David set the photograph on his desk and stared at it for a long time. He had collected hundreds of antique photographs, many of them unsettling in the way that old portraits often are. The long exposure times required subjects to remain motionless for extended periods, creating expressions that seemed haunted or vacant. But this was different. The doll was deliberately destroyed, yet the girl held it as if it were precious. The contrast between the pristine studio setting and the disturbing object in the child's hands created a dissonance that David couldn't shake. He began his research that evening. The name Clara Morrison wasn't particularly uncommon, but combined with the year 1908 and the location of Portland, Maine, he hoped to find some record of her existence. He started with census records, searching through digitized documents on genealogy websites. The 1910 census showed several Morrison families in Portland, but no Clara of the right age. He expanded his search to include death records, birth certificates, and city directories. It took 3 days of searching before he found the first mention. A brief notation in a 1909 Portland City directory listed a Thomas Morrison, physician, residing at 47 Western Promenade with his wife Eleanor and daughter Clara. The Western Promenade was one of Portland's most prestigious addresses in the early 20th century, a tree-lined street overlooking the harbor, where wealthy families built elaborate homes to showcase their success. David felt a surge of excitement. He had a name, an address, and a connection to a prominent family. Dr. Thomas Morrison would have been exactly the sort of person to commission a formal portrait of his daughter, but why would he allow her to be photographed with such a disturbing prop? David searched for more information about the Morrison family, looking for society pages, medical directories, anything that might provide context. What he found instead was silence. After the 1909 city directory listing, the Morrison family seemed to vanish from public records. No obituaries, no property transfers, no mentions in newspapers or medical journals. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. David knew this pattern. He had researched enough historical figures to recognize when information had been deliberately suppressed, or when families had fled scandal by relocating and changing their identities. He decided to visit the address listed in the directory. The Western Promenade had changed significantly since 1909, but many of the original Victorian mansions still stood, converted into apartments or maintained by historical societies. Number 47 might still exist, and even if it didn't, perhaps neighbors or local historians could provide information about the Morrison family. The Western Promenade stretched along a ridge overlooking the harbor, offering views of Casco Bay and the islands beyond. David walked the length of the street on a bright Saturday afternoon, searching for number 47. The houses were magnificent, 3- and 4-story structures with turrets and wraparound porches, painted in bold colors that the Victorians had favored. Many had been meticulously restored, their owners taking pride in maintaining historical accuracy. Number 47 was set back from the street behind a tall iron fence overgrown with vines. The house itself was dark grey, almost black, with white trim that had yellowed with age. Unlike its neighbors, it showed signs of neglect. Several windows on the upper floors were boarded up, and the front porch sagged in the middle. A for sale sign stood in the front yard, so faded that the real estate company name was barely legible. The property had an abandoned quality that made David hesitate at the gate. He pushed through anyway, the metal gate squealing on rusted hinges. The front path was cracked, weeds pushing through the gaps. As he approached the house, he noticed something odd about the windows. Those that weren't boarded showed glass so old that it had begun to ripple, distorting the darkness within. He climbed the porch steps carefully, testing each one before putting his full weight down. There was no doorbell, just a tarnished brass knocker in the shape of a lion's head. David knocked 3 times, not really expecting an answer. The sound echoed inside, and he was about to turn away when he heard movement. Shuffling footsteps approached the door, slow and deliberate. A chain rattled, locks clicked, and the door opened just wide enough for an elderly man to peer out. The man was thin to the point of frailty, with white hair that stood out in wild tufts around his head. His eyes were a watery blue, magnified behind thick glasses. He wore a cardigan that had seen better days, and held the door with one hand while the other gripped a cane. When he spoke, his voice was surprisingly strong, carrying an edge of suspicion. He asked David what he wanted. David explained about the photograph, showing it through the narrow opening. The old man's expression changed instantly. His face went pale, and his grip on the cane tightened until his knuckles turned white. He stared at the image of Clara Morrison for a long moment, before asking where David had found it. When David explained about the estate sale, the man shook his head slowly. The man introduced himself as Robert Morrison. He was Thomas Morrison's grandson, which would have made Clara his aunt, though she had died long before he was born. Robert was 91 years old and had lived in the house alone since his wife passed away 15 years earlier. His children wanted him to move to assisted living, but he refused to leave the property. "Someone had to stay," he said cryptically, "to make sure it was never forgotten." David asked what should never be forgotten. Robert looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to speak. Finally, he stepped back and opened the door wider, gesturing for David to enter. The interior of the house was dark, cluttered with furniture from multiple generations. The air smelled of dust and something else, something medicinal and faintly sweet. Robert led David down a hallway lined with portraits, family members staring down from the walls with solemn expressions. They reached a sitting room, where Robert lowered himself into a worn armchair. He gestured for David to sit on a couch across from him. For several minutes, Robert said nothing, simply staring at the photograph David had placed on the coffee table between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Robert Morrison began to tell a story that his grandfather had passed down, a secret that had poisoned the family for generations. In 1908, Portland was a thriving port city, rebuilt after the devastating fire of 1866. The Morrison family was prominent in society. Dr. Thomas Morrison was a respected physician who specialized in childhood diseases, often treating the children of Portland's wealthiest families. His wife Eleanor came from old money, her family having made their fortune in shipping. Their daughter Clara was their only child, born after Eleanor had suffered 3 miscarriages. Clara was, by all accounts, a bright and spirited child. She loved to read and spent hours in her father's library, devouring books far beyond what was considered appropriate for a girl her age. She was particularly fascinated by her father's medical texts, asking questions that both delighted and disturbed Thomas. He saw in her a keen intelligence that he hoped might be channeled towards suitable pursuits like music or art, as medicine was not a profession open to women in any serious capacity. In the spring of 1908, Clara's behavior began to change. She became withdrawn and refused to play with the children of her parents' friends. She stopped sleeping through the night, and her mother often found her wandering the hallways in her nightgown, talking to herself. When Eleanor asked what was wrong, Clara would only say that the doll needed her. Thomas and Eleanor searched Clara's room but found no doll. They questioned the servants, wondering if someone had given Clara a toy without permission, but everyone denied any knowledge. The situation worsened throughout the summer. Clara began to refuse food, claiming the doll didn't want her to eat. She developed dark circles under her eyes and lost weight rapidly. Thomas, for all his medical knowledge, could find no physical cause for his daughter's decline. He consulted with colleagues, bringing in specialists from Boston who examined Clara and pronounced her suffering from a nervous disorder, common in sensitive children. They recommended rest, fresh air, and strict routine. Nothing worked. By autumn, Clara barely resembled the happy child she had been 6 months earlier. She spoke constantly about the doll, describing it in disturbing detail: porcelain face, missing eye, broken hand. She said the doll had been in the walls, waiting for someone to hear her. Clara claimed the doll showed her things, terrible things that had happened in the house before they moved there. She drew pictures that her parents quickly destroyed, images that Robert's grandfather had described as deeply disturbing, showing scenes of violence and suffering. In October 1908, Eleanor Morrison made a decision that would haunt the family forever. She commissioned a local doll maker to create the exact doll Clara had been describing. Eleanor's reasoning was that if Clara could hold the physical manifestation of her delusion, perhaps she would see it as nothing more than an ordinary toy, and the spell would be broken. The doll maker was initially reluctant. The specifications were bizarre and unsettling, but Eleanor paid generously, and the man completed the work within 2 weeks. When Eleanor presented the doll to Clara, the child's reaction was not what anyone expected. Instead of being frightened or cured of her delusion, Clara embraced the doll with a look of profound relief. She held it constantly, speaking to it in whispers that her parents couldn't quite hear. For a brief period, Clara seemed to improve. She began eating again and sleeping through the night. Thomas and Eleanor allowed themselves to hope that the worst was over. Then came the morning of November 15th, 1908. Thomas Morrison found his daughter in the library, sitting in his reading chair with the doll in her lap. Clara was dead, her face peaceful, as if she had simply fallen asleep. The doll was positioned carefully in her arms. There was no sign of violence, no indication of what had caused an 8-year-old child to die suddenly in the night. The family physician, who arrived to examine the body, could offer no explanation. In an era when childhood death was tragically common, Clara's passing might have been attributed to any number of causes: heart defect, undiagnosed illness, even the nervous disorder that specialists had identified months earlier. But Thomas Morrison knew something was terribly wrong. Robert paused, his hands resting on the head of his cane, eyes fixed not on David, but on something far away in memory. He explained that after Clara's death, the official cause was recorded as heart failure in a minor, a vague diagnosis that comforted no one and satisfied even less. Thomas accepted the certificate for the sake of appearances, but privately, he became consumed by the details surrounding his daughter's final days. He began to scrutinize every moment, every word, every object that had entered Clara's world in that last year, including the doll. The funeral was small but dignified, attended by close family and a few colleagues. The Western Promenade House, once a place of dinners and music, fell into oppressive silence. Eleanor refused to leave Clara's bedroom untouched, preserving the room as a shrine. The doll, however, was not allowed to remain there. Thomas had taken it from Clara's arms before the coffin was closed, unable to bear the sight of it resting against her still chest. He placed it in his study, intending to dispose of it later, but something held him back. For weeks after the funeral, Thomas spent his nights in the study, staring at the doll on his desk. By lamplight, its cracked porcelain seemed to shift, the missing eye socket turning into a dark hole that demanded attention. The remaining glass eye glinted coldly in the light, reflecting distorted images of the room. Thomas tried to analyze his own reaction with clinical detachment, telling himself that grief was warping his perception, that he was assigning meaning to an inanimate object because the true cause of his daughter's death lay beyond his understanding. Yet questions continued to circle his mind. Why had Clara's decline begun before the physical doll existed? How had she described it so precisely, down to the broken hand and missing eye, before Eleanor commissioned the doll maker? Why had she spoken of the doll as if it carried memories of the house predating their arrival? One night in December, after Eleanor had taken laudanum to sleep, Thomas made a decision. He retrieved the doll from his desk and carried it upstairs, not to Clara's room, but to the attic. The attic of the house at 47 Western Promenade was a sprawling, low-ceilinged space filled with trunks, old furniture, and forgotten belongings from previous owners. The Morrisons had purchased the house only 5 years earlier, and much of what had been left behind remained untouched. Thomas lit a single oil lamp and moved slowly through the dust motes, his breath visible in the cold air. He told himself that he was being methodical, that he was simply following the thread of Clara's claims, that the doll had been in the walls, that it had seen things in the house. He began by inspecting the sections of wall that sounded hollow when he tapped them, listening for any change in resonance. Each time he heard something slightly different, he marked the spot with a piece of chalk. The work consumed hours, but grief had already unmoored him from ordinary time. Near the far end of the attic, behind a stack of rotting suitcases, he found a wall segment that sounded distinctly different from the rest. The hollow echo was sharper, closer, as if a cavity lay just beyond the wooden boards. Heart pounding, Thomas set the doll down on a nearby crate and fetched a small hammer and chisel he kept in the attic. With steady hands, he began to remove a section of the paneling, prying loose the narrow boards one by one. Behind the panel, he discovered a hidden recess, no wider than a child's hiding place and no taller than 4 feet. The air that escaped from the cavity was stale and bitter, carrying with it the faint, unmistakable odor of something long rotted. Inside, he saw the remnants of fabric, brittle with age, and a small, rusted tin box. There were also faint scrapings on the inner wood, marks that looked disturbingly like fingernail tracks. Thomas hesitated before reaching in. He retrieved the tin box and opened it carefully. Inside were several folded sheets of paper, discolored and fragile. He unfolded the first and read by the light of the lamp. It was a letter written in a shaky hand, dated March 1893, 15 years before the Morrisons had moved into the house. The writer identified herself as Margaret Hale, a maid who had worked for the house's previous owners. The words on the page were uneven, as if written in great distress. Margaret's letter described a terrible accident. involving the family's youngest daughter, a girl named Eliza, who had gone missing one winter night. The official story was that she had slipped on the icy steps outside and fallen into the ravine beyond the street, her body never recovered. But Margaret insisted that this was a lie. She wrote that Eliza had been locked in the attic for punishment, a practice the parents used when the child misbehaved. On the night of her disappearance, Margaret heard Eliza crying and banging on the attic walls, begging to be let out. The next morning, the parents claimed Eliza had run away. The letter ended abruptly, the last lines smeared and nearly illegible. But Thomas understood enough. There had been another child in this house, another girl who had suffered in these rooms, whose fate had been covered with a polite story for society's benefit. He looked from the letter to the hidden cavity in the wall, to the faint claw marks and the shredded remnants of fabric. A chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the winter air. He turned back toward the crate where he had set the doll. For a moment he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. The doll was no longer lying where he had left it. It was sitting upright, propped against the crate, its single glass eye catching the lamplight. Robert stopped to take a breath, his chest rising and falling with the effort of speech. David remained silent, aware that any interruption might break the fragile thread of the old man's story. Outside, faint traffic sounds from the modern city filtered in through the aging windows, a reminder that time had not stopped, even if this house seemed determined to pretend otherwise. According to Robert, his grandfather never fully accepted what he saw that night in the attic. Thomas was a man of science, trained to dismiss superstition and seek rational explanations. When he saw the doll propped upright, he told himself that he must have placed it that way and simply forgotten. The mind, especially one ravaged by grief, could not always be trusted. He forced himself to pick up the doll and carry it back downstairs, determined to lock it away. Instead of destroying the doll, however, Thomas placed it in a wooden box, along with Margaret Hale's letter and the other papers from the tin box. He sealed the box with nails and stored it in the back of a locked cabinet in his study. Outwardly, he resumed his duties as a physician, seeing patients and attending hospital meetings. Inwardly, he was unraveling. He began to suspect that there was a connection between Eliza and Clara, two girls separated by 15 years, but bound by the same house, the same walls, and now the same doll. Eleanor, meanwhile, was crumbling under the weight of her loss. She became increasingly dependent on laudanum, her days blurring into a haze. She rarely left her bedroom, and when she did, she moved through the house like a ghost. Fingers trailing along the banister Clara used to slide her hand down. The staff gradually left, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere or the unpredictable moods of the grieving couple. By the spring of 1909, only a single housekeeper remained. Robert's voice grew quieter as he described what happened next. One evening in May, Eleanor insisted on visiting Clara's room for the first time in weeks. She asked Thomas to unlock it. He had kept it closed, hoping that time would soften the pain. When they entered, everything was exactly as it had been on the day of the funeral. The white dress folded on the chair, the stack of books on the nightstand, the curtains drawn halfway, letting in a muted light. What had changed was on the bed. The doll lay there, perfectly centered on Clara's pillow, its cracked porcelain face turned toward the door as if it had been waiting. One glass eye stared straight ahead. The empty socket seemed to follow them anyway. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. He knew with absolute certainty that the doll had been sealed in the wooden box in his locked study cabinet. No one else had access. No one else even knew of its existence. Eleanor's reaction was immediate and devastating. She let out a sound that Thomas would later describe to his grandson as not human, a raw tearing noise from somewhere beyond language. She rushed to the bed and grabbed the doll, shaking it violently, screaming Clara's name over and over. Thomas tried to pull her away, but she resisted with a strength he hadn't seen in months. When she finally released the doll, it fell to the floor, its remaining eye cracking on the hardwood. In the days that followed, Eleanor's mental state deteriorated rapidly. She raved about voices in the walls, about a girl crying in the attic, about Clara standing at the foot of the bed, asking why no one had helped her. The family physician, called once again, recommended institutional care. It was a suggestion that carried immense social stigma at the time, especially for a woman of Eleanor's social standing. But Thomas, terrified for her safety, reluctantly agreed. Eleanor was admitted to a private sanitarium outside Boston in late May 1909. She never returned home. She died there 3 years later, officially of complications from pneumonia, though most who knew the full story believed she had died long before her body surrendered. Thomas sold most of his medical practice, keeping only a few patients. He withdrew from society, rarely attending functions or visiting colleagues. Robert leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. He explained that Thomas had confided all of this to his own son, Robert's father, in a series of letters written in the 1920s, long after the events had taken place. Thomas never fully articulated what he believed about the doll or the house, or the girls whose lives had ended too soon. But his actions spoke clearly. In 1910, he had the attic walls sealed more thoroughly, covering the hidden cavity and reinforcing the paneling. He boxed up many of the household's belongings, including the doll, and placed them in storage. By the time Robert was born in 1932, the story of Clara and the doll had already hardened into a family legend, half-whispered and rarely discussed in front of children. The house on the Western Promenade, once grand, had begun its slow decline. Without Eleanor's social gatherings and Thomas's professional income, maintenance lagged. Paint peeled, roofs leaked, and parts of the house were closed off entirely. Yet the doll, Robert said, always seemed to find its way back. He remembered being 8 years old, Clara's age, when he first saw it. He had been exploring the upstairs hallway, ignoring his mother's warnings about old, unsafe rooms, when he pushed open the door to a rarely used guest room. There, sitting upright in a child-sized chair facing the window, was the cracked porcelain doll. One eye gone, one eye fixed, its dress stained and frayed. He hadn't known then what it was, only that it filled him with a dread so intense he backed out of the room without turning his back on it. That night, his father had taken him aside and, in hushed tones, told him never to touch the doll, never to move it, and never to speak of it outside the family. When Robert asked why, his father simply said, "Because we've already lost enough children to this house." David felt a chill run up his spine. The air in the sitting room felt heavier now, pressing against his skin. He glanced at the photograph on the table, the little girl in white, the ruined doll in her hands, the words on the back pleading for forgiveness. He asked the question that had been building since he walked through the door. Where was the doll now? Robert's answer was simple. Closer than you think. Silence settled between them like dust. David became acutely aware of the house's subtle sounds, the faint ticking of an unseen clock, the distant hum of traffic muffled by thick walls, the occasional creak of aged wood expanding and contracting. Robert didn't elaborate immediately. Instead, he pushed himself slowly to his feet, gripping the cane as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the present. He asked David to bring the photograph. They moved together through the dim hallway, passing the stern faces of Morrison ancestors staring down from gilded frames. The farther they walked, the more the house seemed to close in, the ceiling feeling lower, the walls narrower. Robert led him toward the back staircase, narrower and steeper than the main one, the kind servants once used to move unseen. The staircase groaned beneath their weight. As they climbed, the light thinned, replaced by a grey wash filtering through small, dirty windows. On the second floor, Robert turned not toward the bedrooms but toward a short corridor ending in a door painted the color of old bones. The paint was chipped and cracked, revealing older layers beneath. A simple iron keyhole sat beneath a tarnished knob. Robert paused there, breathing hard. He said this door had remained locked for most of his childhood. It led to the room where Clara had slept, later repurposed and then abandoned as the family dwindled. No one lived in that room now. No one, Robert said, had lived there for a very long time. Yet, over the years, he had heard sounds from within, soft thumps, the scrape of something light against the floorboards, once even the unmistakable creak of a small chair moving across wood. He reached into his cardigan pocket and withdrew a key attached to a thin brass chain. His hand trembled as he held it out to David. The gesture was deliberate, symbolic. Robert was, in his own way, passing on responsibility. He said he had kept the door locked for decades, convinced that as long as he stayed in the house and kept that boundary intact, whatever his family had unleashed would remain contained. But age had stripped him of certainty. He could no longer tell whether his vigilance protected anyone or simply prolonged an old wound. David hesitated before taking the key. Its metal was cold, oddly heavy for something so small. He slid it into the lock, hearing the mechanism click with surprising clarity. For a moment, he felt the irrational urge to walk away, to apologize, to claim suddenly remembered obligations and leave this house with its ghosts of memory and grief. But curiosity, the same force that had led him into countless archives and attics, anchored him in place. He turned the knob. The door opened onto a room preserved in the faded dignity of another era. The wallpaper, once floral, had dulled to a pattern of beige and brown. A narrow bed stood against one wall, its brass frame tarnished, the mattress covered by a thin quilt whose colors had long since bled away. By the window, a small wooden chair sat slightly askew, as if someone had risen abruptly and never returned to straighten it. Dust coated every surface, but the arrangement of the furniture felt intentional, not chaotic. What drew David's eye immediately was the small table beside the bed. On it rested an empty oval frame, the twin, in style and size, of the one he had purchased from the antique shop. The glass was gone, the backing stained with time. A faint rectangular outline in the dust suggested where the frame had sat undisturbed for years. Now there was only absence, a missing image that matched the portrait he carried. He stepped into the room, the floorboards flexing beneath his weight. Robert remained at the threshold, as though an invisible line separated him from the space within. David moved slowly, aware of every sound he made. He set the photograph of Clara and the doll on the bedside table, aligning it with the ghostly outline left by the original. Then he saw it. The doll sat in the corner, half hidden in shadow, propped against the junction of two walls. Time had not been kind to it. The porcelain face was more heavily cracked than in the photograph, a network of fine lines radiating from the empty socket. The remaining glass eye, cloudy now, still managed to catch the limited light, reflecting a dull glimmer. Its dress, once white, perhaps, was a sallow grey, torn at the hem and stained with indistinguishable marks. One porcelain hand was broken off at the wrist, leaving a jagged edge. For a long moment, David simply looked at it. The sight triggered an odd double recognition. The rational part of his mind catalogued the doll's features as artifacts, a damaged antique toy, typical of its era, while another, deeper part responded with a visceral unease that defied explanation. It wasn't simply the damage or the age. It was the sense that the doll's presence in this exact corner, in this exact room, had been deliberate. He asked Robert whether anyone had moved the doll recently. Robert shook his head. He claimed he hadn't opened the door to this room in more than a decade. His last memory of the doll placed it somewhere else entirely, in a trunk in the attic, wrapped in a sheet. He admitted he had been too afraid to verify its location in recent years, choosing instead to believe it remained where he'd left it. David stepped closer. There was no sudden rush of cold air, no flickering lights, nothing that could be dismissed as a cliché of horror. Instead, there was an intensification of the same oppressive weight he had felt downstairs, as though the cumulative grief of everyone who had ever stood in this room still hung like residue in the air. He knelt carefully, inspecting the floor around the doll. Dust patterns told their own kind of story. A faint trail, no wider than the base of the doll's dress, cut through the dust from the opposite corner of the room to where it now sat. The line wasn't sharp enough to suggest recent movement, but it existed, a subtle disruption in the otherwise even layer. David felt his throat tighten. He was not a man given to superstition. His world was one of provenance, dates, signatures, and physical proof, yet here he was, kneeling before an object that seemed to deny the neat boundaries between past and present, between the dead and the living. He reached out, then stopped, his hand hovering inches away. Touching it felt like a kind of consent he wasn't ready to give. Behind him, Robert finally spoke. He said that over the years, every time the family had tried to remove or destroy the doll, misfortune had followed. Accidents, illnesses, sudden deaths that defied neat explanations. Whether those events were causally linked or simply cruel coincidences, no one could say with certainty. But patterns, once noticed, were hard to unsee. David straightened slowly and turned back toward the bed. The photograph of Clara seemed sharper now, more immediate. Her hands, so small and careful, cradled the damaged doll as if protecting it. The inscription on the back, "God forgive us all," took on a heavier weight. Forgive them for what? For Eliza? For Clara? For every decision made in this house that placed children at the mercy of adult choices and adult secrets? He realized with a sudden clarity that this was not just a story about a haunted object or a cursed family. It was a story about what happens when suffering is buried instead of acknowledged, when guilt is hidden instead of confessed, when the past is locked behind doors and left to fester. Standing in Clara's room, between the photograph and the doll, David understood that the question was no longer whether the doll was dangerous, or even whether something unexplainable had taken root in this house. The question was simpler and far more unsettling. What was he going to do now that he knew? The decision did not come immediately. It unfolded slowly, over the course of the next hour, as David and Robert left Clara's room and returned to the sitting room downstairs. The house seemed different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because the story layered over its architecture had become clearer. Every creak felt like punctuation. Every shadow suggested the outline of a long, absent figure. Robert sank back into his armchair, exhausted. Telling the story had cost him something, the way reopening an old wound always does. David sat opposite him, the photograph resting on his knees, the edges of the cardstock soft under his fingers. He asked practical questions at first, about dates, about other relatives, about the contents of Thomas's letters. But he knew that gathering facts was only part of why he was still here. He was trying to delay facing the real choice. Robert acknowledged that selling the house had taken years of persuasion from his children. They saw only an old, decaying property worth more as land than as history. To them, the past was a set of stories that could be boxed up, archived, or discarded. Robert had resisted, clinging to the belief that someone in the family needed to remain as a kind of caretaker, a living witness to what had happened. But he had reached the limits of what his aging body and mind could manage. He looked at David with a searching gaze and asked a question of his own. "Why did you come here, really?" It was not accusatory, merely curious. David thought about the hours spent in the antique shop, the thrill of finding the photograph, the impulse to dig deeper once he'd read the inscription. He answered honestly. He had come because something in the image felt unfinished, because the combination of the girl, the doll, and the desperate plea on the back suggested a story that someone had tried very hard to silence. Robert nodded, as if this confirmed something he already suspected. He said that every generation of the Morrison family had produced at least one person who became obsessed with the story. Thomas with his investigations, Robert's father with his careful preservation of letters, Robert himself with his refusal to abandon the house. Each of them had tried to do something to contain or resolve what had been set in motion in 1908, perhaps even earlier. None had fully succeeded. David realized that whether he liked it or not, he had stepped into that lineage the moment he bought the photograph. They talked about options. They could destroy the doll, burn it, smash it, consign it to the bottom of the harbor. But Robert recounted how previous attempts to remove it from the house had been thwarted by uncanny obstacles, sudden illnesses that forced trips to be cancelled, car accidents en route to supposed destinations, objects misplaced or inexplicably returned to their original locations. Again, David could rationalize each of these as coincidence, as the kind of pattern-seeking that humans are wired to perform. Yet the cumulative weight of them pressed against his skepticism. They could also leave everything as it was. The house would be sold, likely to a developer who would gut the interior, tearing down walls and ripping up floors in the name of renovation. The doll might be thrown away or boxed up anonymously, or sold in some future estate lot the way the photograph had been. The story would fracture, pieces scattered beyond recognition. Whatever had bound the house, the doll and the Morrison family might dissipate, or it might simply find new ways to surface, detached from its context and therefore even harder to understand. Neither option felt right. Finally, tentatively, they considered a third possibility: documentation. Not just the piecemeal letters and half-whispered family legends, but a comprehensive account that would place every known fact, every credible memory, every artifact, including the photograph and the doll, into a single coherent narrative. not to sensationalize but to bear witness, to ensure that the suffering of Clara, of Eliza, of Eleanor, and of everyone else touched by those events would not be reduced to a footnote or a local rumor. David recognized this path. It was, in many ways, the work he had been doing his entire adult life, taking forgotten lives and restoring them to the record. He would approach this not as a believer or a skeptic, but as an archivist. He would catalogue the letters, digitize the photograph, record interviews with Robert while he still could. He would research property records, newspaper archives, court documents. He would trace the history of the house at 47 Western Promenade, from its construction to its sale, mapping every family that had passed through its rooms. But there was one more step that neither man mentioned at first, though both were thinking about it. The doll could not simply be left in the corner of an upstairs room in a house that would soon no longer belong to the Morrisons, nor, perhaps, should it be destroyed outright, if only because destruction might erase evidence as surely as it might end any lingering harm. Instead, David proposed something that felt at once deeply rational and quietly radical. He would take custody of it. The idea hung in the air for a long moment. Robert studied him, weighing the seriousness in his voice, the steadiness in his eyes. David explained that he had secure storage for his collection, climate-controlled and monitored. He dealt regularly with fragile objects that needed careful handling. He would not display the doll or exploit it. He would treat it as an artifact tied to a documented case of historical trauma. Its movement from the house would be recorded, photographed, and witnessed. No more mysterious disappearances, no more untraceable relocations. Robert asked if he was afraid. David answered truthfully, yes, but not in the way Robert might assume. He was afraid of what would happen if the story remained half-told. If the doll were left to circulate without context, a disturbing curiosity stripped of the human lives behind it. He was afraid of silence more than of any object. In the end, Robert agreed. The transfer took place with quiet formality. They returned upstairs together. David wrapped the doll in acid-free tissue and placed it in a sturdy archival box he had brought for transporting fragile photographs. He documented every step with his phone's camera, not for spectacle, but for record-keeping. The doll, once boxed, looked suddenly small, its menace contained but not negated. He also took the original portrait frame from the bedside table, matching it with the photograph he'd purchased. The two belonged together. Separated, each had been a puzzle piece without a border. Reunited, they formed an anchor for the narrative he would construct. As David prepared to leave, carrying the boxed doll and the photograph, Robert walked him to the door. The late afternoon light had shifted, casting long shadows across the western promenade. The house in that moment looked tired rather than threatening, like an old actor stepping off stage after a performance that had gone on too long. At the threshold, Robert placed a hand on David's arm. He said that whatever David eventually wrote or shared, he should remember one thing. This was, above all, a story about people who failed to understand their own capacity for harm until it was too late. Parents who trusted institutions more than their instincts. Employers who dismissed the testimony of a frightened maid. A society that preferred polite lies over uncomfortable truths about how children were treated behind closed doors. David nodded. He promised to center the people, not the object. Months later, in his small home office crowded with boxes and folders, David would sit at his desk, the framed photograph of Clara propped beside his computer. The sealed archival box containing the doll would rest on a shelf behind him, labeled in neat handwriting, Morrison Family Artifact, Circa 1893-1908, Restricted Access. He would begin to write, not as a narrator seeking to frighten, but as a witness assembling evidence. Yet even as he typed out dates and names and cross-references, the image of the portrait would linger in his peripheral vision, the little girl in the lace dress, the ruined doll in her arms, the weight of a century's silence in her unblinking stare. The photograph from 1908 still looked harmless at a glance. It always would, to those who didn't know where to look or what questions to ask. But for anyone who had heard the full story, for anyone who understood what the girl was holding and what it represented, the image would never again be just an old picture in a tarnished frame. It would be a reminder that some of the darkest things we pass down are not objects or legends. but the consequences of what we refuse to face. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.